The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, David Daley on how to restore fairness and democracy to elections. John Judis and a progressive vision of populism and nationalism. Plus, Bill Press on how to solve America's immigration crisis. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. The Supreme Court's decision on partisan gerrymandering dealt a huge blow to the future of democratic elections in America. David Daley is one of the nation's leading experts on partisan gerrymandering. He says it's not too late to fight back. And we say hello to David Daley, author of the national bestseller Rat Effed, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count. Yes, I took liberty with the title of that book. He's also the former editor-in-chief of Salon and a senior fellow for Fair Vote. David Daley, thank you so much for joining us again on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. You know, you write and talk extensively about the political impact of gerrymandering. We had a major decision in June from the Supreme Court on this. Basically, they won't make a decision. How do you see the impact of that, say, non-decision decision?
Yeah, I think it was an extraordinarily dangerous decision by the Supreme Court. Essentially, in a 5-4 a party line vote, the court slammed the doors of the federal courthouses shut to all future partisan gerrymandering claims. And this stopped momentum across the country that had been building as federal courts nationwide, made up of bipartisan panels, judges appointed by Democratic presidents, Republican presidents, all sent a clear message to the Supreme Court that we think partisan gerrymandering is a serious problem, and we have the tools to identify these gerrymanders and put an end to it. You had maps that had been overturned in Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Maryland, in which judges said these maps are an affront to a representative democracy. And the court said, well, we don't think that the federal courts ought to be in the business of making that decision, and it is going to open the doors to just an unfettered festival of partisan gerrymandering in 2021 when we go through redistricting all over again. There's going to be no threat of the Supreme Court coming down with a decision that stops these politicians. So they're going to be able to do whatever they want, and I think that's a frightening.
Do you have any hope that extreme partisan gerrymandering can be rectified through the courts?
Not the federal courts. I do think that there's hope in the state courts. The one place now where all of this action moves will be to state courts, which often have a more robust protection of the right to vote than the U.S. Constitution. The best example here is Pennsylvania, which had a Republican gerrymander that had locked the state's congressional delegation into 13 Republicans and 5 Democrats, right? From a state like Pennsylvania, it was 13-5 all decade long until in January of 2018, the state Supreme Court said that map was an unconstitutional partisan gerrymander. They overthrew it. They brought in a nonpartisan special master, a professor out at Stanford. They said, you draw the districts. He came up with a map that in November of 2018 elected 9 Republicans and 9 Democrats, exactly what you might imagine out of Pennsylvania, right? So this does mean that instead of one national standard, it's going to require action in all of these in all of these state courthouses around the country. some of these state Supreme Courts are going to be more open to fixing this than others. So the possibility becomes here that there becomes, a democracy desert in some parts of the country where judges won't act on this, and then perhaps other coastal bluer states that actually have functioning democracies still.
Mm-hmm. Let's turn now to the census. This was an all-out fight on the part of the GOP to include the census question, and along the way, we learned some alarming truths by way of released files from the now-deceased Thomas Hofeller. Remind us of who he was.
Thomas Hofeller is probably one of the most influential Republican strategists that no one had really ever heard of. Hofeller, for the last 4 decades, has been the man behind the scenes, running the maps, working on the computer programs, kind of strategizing how to use redistricting at every turn to squeeze the most partisan advantage for his side that he possibly could. And he'd been extraordinarily effective at this. I mean, Hofeller in many ways is a visionary who was able to sort of see around the corner every decade, understand where his side could gain advantage, and then he put it into place and executed it. So this last round of Republican gerrymanders was largely his. In many ways right now, we are living in Tom Hofeller's America.
Mm. Now, you also were actually one of those who had access to those files. What did we learn about the GOP's strategy with regard to gerrymandering?
Well, Tom Hofeller has a plan again. Tom Hofeller died in the summer of 2018, but he had a plan in place already for the next round of redistricting in 2021. And that plan, we learned from his memos and his files, involved the citizenship question on the census. This is what Hofeller wants to do, and let me break it down so I can try to make something a little bit wonky as simple as possible. But right now, we redraw state legislative districts. The standard is to do this based on total population. So that's absolutely everybody. It's citizens, it's non-citizens, it's voters, it's non-voters, it's children under the age of 18, and people of voting age. And the idea is, it goes back to the founding ideals of the country in many ways, that representation is ideally about everybody. And what Hofeller wants to do, and what he investigated, was trying to figure out what would state legislative maps look like if they were drawn not based on total population, but rather based on citizen voting age population. So changing this so that it's only citizens and it's only people over the age of 18. And what Hofeller found is that the impact of this would be to make a state like Texas that has a growing Latino population, you could still find a way to district in a way that enhanced the political power of whites, Republicans, and more rural areas. It would be as simple for Republicans to make this switch to citizen voting age population by passing a statute in these state legislatures. This is where the redistricting fight is going to be over the next couple of years.
We're speaking with David Daley, author of the national bestseller Rat Effed, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count. He's also the former editor-in-chief of Salon and a senior fellow for Fair Vote. David, the Supreme Court blocked the Trump administration from including the citizenship question on the census, calling the administration's reasoning contrived. So where does the story go from here?
It's a really good question. It appears that the question will certainly not be on the census. And Hofeller always argued that he needed the question on the census in order to get the data that he needed in order to draw the districts using citizen voting age population. There are a lot of Republicans who think that they can find that information elsewhere, sort of through other studies that the government does by combining other data sets. So I think that the census question has probably had the brakes applied to it pretty effectively, but I don't think that we've seen the end of citizen voting age population as a redistricting strategy.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also recently wrote an article for Salon titled, "Should Democrats Gerrymander?" And your answer is, no, it's bad politics and there's a better way. In part, you argue it just wouldn't work. Why not?
Well, if you look at it right now, Democrats only control 18 state legislatures across the country. And when you're thinking about redistricting, what you want to think about is who has a seat at the table when it comes to draw the map. And every state's a little bit differently done, but in most states it's some combination of the governor and the two branches of the state legislature. So the best way to have complete control over redistricting is to have a trifecta, to control all three of those. Democrats right now have got 18 places where they could enforce their will on redistricting. The trouble is there's just not a lot of seats that they can squeeze out of any of those states. 6 of them, California, Colorado, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, and Washington, use some kind of independent commissions. 2 others, Delaware and Vermont, they only have 1 U.S. House member, so there's nothing to gerrymander there.
Right.
Hawaii, Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Mexico, and Rhode Island, Democrats already hold every single seat from all of those states. They could mess around and try to strengthen those seats a little bit, but there's probably not much to gain there. Democrats have got Maryland and Nevada and Oregon, but each of those states are already down to just 1 Republican. Could Democrats try to shoot the moon in some of those states? They could, but trouble is when you try to go too far, sometimes the gerrymander can backfire on you, and the incumbents who are in place don't always like that. They tend to want a safe district. So if you cut it too thin to try to maximize the number of seats a party can get, you might have incumbents who are powerful in this process say, I'm not so sure about that. I'm fine if it's 7-1 and my district is a little bit safer. So really that only leaves Illinois as a state where Democrats might try to improve their odds. And Democrats already have 13 of 18 seats in Illinois. So you could maybe gain a seat or 2 there. But you would have to sort of use Chicago in such a way and sort of draw. In 2011, Democrats used Chicago as kind of like a pizza slicer, right? And they made districts that kind of take a piece of Chicago and attached it to a whole bunch of slices. So if in 2021 Democrats went the spaghetti spiral approach instead and kind of tried to spiral districts out of Chicago and run them down along the entire process of the state, maybe you could get a couple more seats that way. But at this point in time, you're talking about such little gain, and you're talking about giving up the moral high ground on what ought to be a question of good government and basic fairness and democracy. So I don't think that gerrymandering themselves in the places where they already have power is likely to be fruitful or productive.
You argue that Democrats would be much wiser to take on the issue of redistricting itself rather than engage in playing the game. In addition to fighting in the courts, what are some of the political solutions that you see as hopeful? I mean, you've written, for example, about ranked choice voting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a great possibility in ranked choice voting as far as, taking some of these states around the country that are essentially one-party states right now in their congressional delegations. And these are, Democratic states as well as Republican states. And if you districted them in a different way, there's a Virginia congressman named Don Beyer who's just put forth something called the Fair Representation Act, which combines larger multi-member districts with ranked choice voting. And if you do that, suddenly there's the possibility of just really transforming and opening up our politics in all kinds of exciting, creative ways. I think one of the things that we all sort of bemoan about the current state of our politics is just how sort of polarized and extreme it's all become. And it's single member winner take all districts that have done, so much to send to Washington people who have, no incentive to talk to the other side, no incentive to a compromise, and to try to work together and solve problems. And if you gave them different incentives, suddenly it's easy to imagine that politicians would behave differently. And it's also easy to imagine how a different electoral structure just elects different people in the first place. If you took a state like Ohio, for example, which right now from 16 single-member districts sends 12 Republicans and 4 Democrats to Washington. I mean, it's just wildly unrepresentative of the state. But if Ohio was, cut into 4 districts, and each of those districts had 4 representatives, suddenly those specific lines don't matter as much, so the gerrymanders lose their power. And larger districts are going to elect a diverse slate of people, a diverse ideological group, a diverse ethnically and racially, along gender lines. And I think it really has the power to, make us think of our politics differently.
And a more accurate representation of your constituents, too, at the same time.
I think that's exactly right.
Now, in another interview, you said that democracy used to be something we all agreed on. How would you characterize that now? And what is the danger in no longer having a shared definition of democracy?
Yeah, I mean, this is a frightening moment in a lot of ways. You only have to go back to the early part of this century when the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized in the early years of the George W. Bush administration. So we're talking about 2003. It was nearly unanimous in the U.S. Senate and in the U.S. House. And to think that we've gone from that moment in which reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act was a nonpartisan moment of celebration as it was extended by Democrats and Republicans under a Republican administration. And it's almost impossible to imagine that happening now after a conservative court has gutted the Voting Rights Act, and as states around the country, almost all of them under complete control by Republicans. And I don't say this to sound like a partisan or to appeal to a partisan crowd. There have been 25 states that have adopted voter ID in the last decade. 24 of those 25 were entirely run by Republicans. So this is, in many ways, a very partisan issue. One side is pushing this, the other is not. And so the danger here is that we've become a nation that is increasingly anti-majoritarian, and that districting and voter ID is being used to disenfranchise voters. It's being used by Republicans to make it harder for Democrats, especially Democrats of color, to vote. And you have states like North Carolina and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan where a majority of Democrats cannot elect a majority of Democratic representatives, in which consistently across this decade under these maps, Democrats win more votes, Republicans hold more seats, and there's almost nothing you can do about it. You look at Wisconsin in 2018. The Democrats win the governorship, the U.S. Senate, sweep all the statewide offices, and win the popular vote for Wisconsin's assembly by 200,000 votes statewide, and they gain 1 seat and cut into a Republican majority that is now 63-36. So we are in a dangerous moment of anti-majoritarianism that calls into question the basic tenets of representative democracy. When people stop believing that elections are legitimate, where are we? So I hope that we can solve this, and that we have to solve it in a way that is everybody coming together and talking about this. I do believe that voters get it. I mean, if you look last year, November 2018, there were 15 big democracy initiatives on the ballot, and 96% of them won. They won in red states and blue states and purple states. You had redistricting reform pass in Utah and Missouri. You had felon reenfranchisement pass in Florida with 64% of the vote. In Michigan and Ohio, and a Medicaid expansion in Idaho and Nebraska. So I think that these basic issues of democracy reform resonate with voters. There's just a certain kind of conservative politician right now that hasn't gotten the message.
Mm-hmm. David Daley, author of the national bestseller Rat Effed, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count. He's also the former editor-in-chief of Salon and a senior fellow for Fair Vote, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. David, as always, we appreciate your time with us today and look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thanks so much. Anytime.
Sounds good. Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, reclaiming populism and nationalism for a progressive future. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
For generations, our country has been Mother Nature's steward, setting aside and protecting important expanses of public lands for posterity. But what if these lands and natural resources suddenly got a steward who was a predator rather than a protector? Meet William Perry Penley. For more than 40 years, he's been a fringe political operative and lawyer for a network of loopy anti-environmental extremists intent on helping corporate predators grab and plunder our national assets for their private profit. And now, holy Teddy Roosevelt, developer-in-chief Donald Trump has named Penley to be acting head of the Bureau of Land Management. Yes, a guy who favors the wholesale privatization of your and my public lands is to oversee the future of America's public lands. Indeed, Penley has been lost in the ultra-right-wing weeds for years, screeching that, quote, the Founding Fathers intended all lands owned by the federal government to be sold. That's nuts, but nuttier yet is Penley's listing of a sextet of demons he believes are at war with Western civilization, radical environmentalists, federal bureaucrats, the media, academia, Hollywood, and ignorant Americans who are easily panicked into believing in things like climate change. But this caped corporate crusader saves most of his manic fury for the environmental movement, bizarrely proclaiming that its millions of adherents, quote, don't believe in human beings. Also, with funding from the Koch brothers and Big Oil, Penley has been a fanatical fossil fuel proselytizer, even declaring in a moment of rapture that fracking is, quote, an energy, economic, and environmental miracle. This is Jim Hightower saying, don't just keep an eye on this corporate extremist, don't even blink. For updates, contact Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility at peer.org.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Across the globe, nationalism and populism are being co-opted by the right, and democracy is paying the price. Veteran journalist John Judis says it doesn't have to be that way. He says the left needs to embrace both ideas for the promise they hold for a progressive and inclusive politics. And we say hello to John B. Judis, editor-at-large at Talking Points Memo and the author of The Populist Explosion, How the Great Recession Transformed American and European Politics, and The Nationalist Revival, Trade, Immigration, and the Revolt Against Globalization. John Judis, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And our pleasure to have you with us. So you've written two very important books about two ideas that are becoming ever more relevant in today's political climate, populism and nationalism. And as you've shown us, both of these ideas have taken on toxic qualities in recent times, beginning with nationalism. How do you see it expressing itself in a way that is damaging, especially in the United States?
Well, the main way is nativism, us versus them. The idea that we're not simply a separate nation, but that we're being invaded by alien hordes from south of the border, and that they're rapists and terrorists and dope smugglers. That's the toxic form that nationalism has taken, and there's some form of that in a lot of the countries in Europe too.
Now, some of our listeners may be surprised that you argue for progressives to actually embrace nationalism. Why is nationalism an important idea for progressives?
Well, let's talk about it in terms of having a national identity and feeling that we're part of one nation. You really can't have a democracy unless people feel that other people whom they never will know, see, have a conversation with, have an equal right to determine the main public officials in the country. And you can't do that unless you have an idea that you have something in common with those people, that they're citizens of the same nation. Now, you can move that up to having an advanced welfare state. If I'm paying taxes and my taxes are going to go for health care for somebody in Olympia, Washington, who I'll never see, never know, who's disabled in some way, who has some, blind, what have you, I have to believe that as an American, as a fellow American, it's fine to give that person my tax dollars. If I don't think so, if I think that it's going to somebody who's has nothing in common with me, is not an American, then you get a real problem. And that's why we're having these kind of conflicts over Obamacare, over health care policy in Europe, welfare provisions, because we're losing that sense, again, of being one nation and that our tax dollars can go to whomever is a citizen, regardless of whether we know them or see them.
Mm-hmm. One for all for one.
Yes, and that's a very basic sentiment. And if we lose that, and if people start to say, well, it's not important to feel that you're an American, you're a citizen of the world, then you're really asking for trouble.
Mm-hmm. Now, in embracing nationalism, what are some of the pitfalls progressives need to avoid?
Well, the obvious pitfall we've already talked about, the kind of us versus them scapegoating and using, let's say, undocumented or illegal immigrants to explain problems that are really not their responsibility, that they really can't be blamed for. In Hungary, for instance, we're moving across to Eastern Europe. The problem with refugees and asylum seekers was used by the government to some extent to justify authoritarian measures and to bridge their democracy. So, obviously that can be a problem with nationalism. But again, I would urge upon people, especially liberals and the left, to look at it from the other side and look at the consequences of denying the importance of feeling that we are part of one nation and that we have certain citizenship requirements and that we have borders and things like that.
We're speaking to John Judis, an editor-at-large at Talking Points Memo, author of The Populist Explosion, How the Great Recession Transformed American and European Politics, as well as The Nationalist Revival, Trade, Immigration, and the Revolt Against Globalization. John, turning now to populism. You've written that it's an idea being championed by both the left and the right. How does populism sound different, though, coming from those two opposite ends of the spectrum?
Well, the basic idea of populist politics is the people versus the elites. It's a politics where there are two terms and there's a kind of antagonism between the two, a conflict. And if you look at let's say in 2016 at Trump and Bernie Sanders campaigns, there were a lot in common between those campaigns. Trump, and you might forget about this now, was attacking corporations for moving their headquarters overseas in order to avoid taxes. He was attacking companies who moved to Mexico or across the Pacific Ocean in order to avoid paying American workers decent wages. And the same kind of complaints were being made by Bernie Sanders and, are in this campaign by Sanders and Warren. But the difference is that what you get with the right-wing varieties of populism is another term, another element, a third element, which is the idea that the elites are coddling this other group, illegal immigrants, Muslims, African Americans, and that also is a real cause of the problems in the country. So you do get something that's very much in common. You get the you get the conflict with the elites over trade, over taxes and things like that. But you also get this other third element, and that's what differentiates the right wing from the more liberal or left wing varieties of populism.
And as we look now at the field of Democratic candidates vying for the White House, do you see any expressing the kind of populism that can support progressive change?
Well, the Sanders and Warren are very much in a populist tradition. When Sanders attacks the billionaire class, when Warren calls out Wall Street and big finance. Those are the kind of populist appeals that you've been seeing in American politics since the 1890s. And they're also advancing programs that are classically populist, that it's possible for Americans to enact, but that the political establishment of both parties rejects. For instance, Sanders, Medicare for all, Warren's wealth tax. Those are the kind of demands that separate the people from the elites.
A while back, you wrote a piece about Sherrod Brown, who will not be running for president, one of the few that's not running for president, I think. But you wrote that other candidates should borrow from his playbook. So what are the things that they can learn from him?
Well, I think one of the things I liked about Sherrod Brown and about his politics is that he's actually in many respects a radical and on the left, but he doesn't appear to be. and it's partly temperament, and it's partly the way he comes off. He's not an angry politician, but I think it's also a matter of what he focuses on. Brown focuses very much on the power relations between workers and corporations and workers and Wall Street. He supports very ambitious social programs, but not to the same extent that Sanders or Warren do. Sherrod Brown was skeptical about Medicare for all, and I am too, as a political demand in 2020, because I think it does raise a lot of hackles among voters about taxes and spending, and will shift the onus of trying to defend their program from the Republicans to the Democrats. So I think he's an example of somebody who was radical but yet could appear moderate, and that's really what I think that either Sanders or Warren should try to do once if it happens that they get the nomination for the Democratic presidential race.
We want to put titles on against all the names of all the different people running for president on both sides of the aisle. Is moderate progressive Sherrod Brown? Is that kind of where we need to go right now, you think?
Oh, I don't know. Again, in terms of the kind of things that Brown demanded of companies, and his attack against companies for moving their headquarters and for denying unions, he was not a moderate. I think what I was trying to say was that his focus on the power relations between workers and business was very important, and that's what I think distinguished him from many of the other Democrats, and particularly again from besides Sanders and Warren, from the other people who are running now for president on the Democratic ticket. But he decided not to run, so it's not we're not comparing presidential candidates here.
No, that's true, and I kind of feel bad that we're not. We don't have the opportunity to. John Judis, editor-at-large at Talking Points Memo, author of The Populist Explosion, How the Great Recession Transformed American and European Politics, and also The Nationalist Revival, Trade, Immigration, and the Revolt Against Globalization. John, we want to thank you for your time today on the America's Democrats podcast. We look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Okay, good. Thank you.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press gets to the truth about immigration with Tom Jowitz, Vice President for Immigration Policy at the Center for American Progress.
Let's just start out on the illegal immigration front, if you will. Is there a crisis at the southern border?
I mean, no question we are experiencing a greater challenge at the southern border than we've experienced in a few years. If you take a step back on why we're experiencing that, there are a lot of reasons. One is that the fundamentals haven't changed. There is a lot of great human insecurity in three countries in particular in Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, where people are facing a huge amount of violence, a huge amount of personal insecurity, a degradation of the rule of law in those countries, and in some parts of some of those countries, huge food insecurity. I mean, famine actually beginning to spread due to climate change. And so there's a lot of there's a great need out there, and people are responding to that need by fleeing and coming to the southwest border. Now, part of the cause of the chaos and disorder is both how the administration has responded to those conditions in those countries and also how the administration has responded to the pressure at the border.
But in terms of sheer numbers of people coming across the border, are we according to Donald Trump, there's never been seen this many people flowing to the border. I'm from California. I think I remember a lot more people.
Yeah, certainly not. I mean, we have had larger numbers of people coming to the U.S. border in the past. We've had 1.6 million people a year coming several decades ago, but the numbers are up from where they were a couple of years ago, certainly. And the makeup of the people who are coming are different. We're seeing far fewer single adult men of working age coming to the United States, and we're seeing a larger number of families with minor children who are coming and presenting themselves. And that does present some unique challenges in how we interpret what's going on and how we can respond to it responsibly.
Well, I'm glad you went there because I wanted to ask you about that. It is the nature of the people who are coming to the border that has changed dramatically from the days when they were single men basically coming to work in the fields, right? And so is our system designed to handle this new population?
It's really complicated because, the situation at the border is presenting itself as an asylum problem, right? Because many of these people are expressing a fear of persecution, and they're, in overwhelming numbers being found to actually possess a credible fear of persecution. And the question becomes, do we have the resources to quickly and effectively and fairly adjudicate those claims? But the strains that we'd be experiencing at the border to adjudicate those claims would be far, far less if we were taking a completely different approach to how we deal with immigration and humanitarian crises in our hemisphere than we are today. So, for instance, one thing the administration has done is cut off all foreign aid to these countries in Central America. It has increased deportations. It has threatened to end temporary protected status, the status that hundreds of thousands of Hondurans and Salvadorans have, that would further destabilize things in the region. It's basically undermined efforts to combat corruption in these countries, especially Guatemala. The things it is doing is increasing insecurity and destabilization in the region, which is increasing the flow of folks coming here. So one thing we could do is just stop being so destructive to conditions in the region and actually get back in the game to help improve conditions. Another thing we could think through, would be rather than shutting down completely our refugee admissions program, which is an orderly way of providing a possibility for safety for people who are fleeing persecution, we could actually dedicate resources. An administration trying to solve this problem would have 2 years ago stood up a dedicated refugee admissions program for Central America, and we'd be partnering with the United Nations in order to find people who can be referred from the region for this program, so we could adjudicate their claims, we could do all the background checks, we could bring them in an orderly fashion, thereby not necessarily eliminating, but decreasing the strain along the border. There are things we could do that would be real solutions here.
And the violence that they talk about in these countries is real.
The violence is extremely real. They're some of the most dangerous places in the entire world. And, again, one of the other things that's so important is the violence, again, in particular for children, that was driving so many young people to flee from El Salvador several years ago, that those homicide numbers began to come down, at least in part because of investments, smart strategic investments that we were helping to make in decreasing violence against young people in El Salvador. And those are exactly the funds that this administration has now cut off and zeroed out, right? So we can make positive moves in order to reduce the need for people to come to the United States in a regular fashion and request protection. We can improve their lot in this world, and thereby also benefit our own ability to have a safe and orderly system. But we're just not doing that because I think Adam Serwer was brilliant when he made his piece a year plus ago. The cruelty is the point. I think the next level of that is that the chaos is the point as well, because the administration, for political and policy reasons, feeds off of the chaos that they create.
I saw the new head of the border, or maybe his new head of ICE the other day, say that they had no choice but to split up these families. I mean, they had to do so. That's what the law says. Is that right?
No, I mean, that's one of the biggest lies. I mean, I hesitate to say that because there have been so many lies, but it's absolutely untrue that the law required the administration to separate these families. Nothing changed in the law from when Donald Trump became president to when past administrations were in office, and no previous administration ever adopted a policy that required the separation of families. Even something like the zero tolerance prosecution policy, right? They knowingly adopted a policy of referring family members for prosecution, which they then said resulted in the separation of families. that policy drove much of the family separation and was very much the heart of it. But even the criminal laws in place don't require family separation, because those laws have been in place for nearly 100 years, and no previous administration had used those criminal laws as a weapon in order to force the separation of families. But this administration separated families even without prosecuting parents. You had a parent with a minor child coming to the port of entry to request asylum, and even though they couldn't even be lawfully prosecuted for illegal entry, they were still being separated from one another, placed into different facilities, and basically lost in the system.
So back to these families that are coming. I mean, with a system that was designed to deal with people crossing illegally the border, looking for jobs, wherever, switching to that, to families that are coming, men and mothers and fathers and their little kids, are we equipped to handle that? I mean, do we have facilities to take care of these families while they're seeking asylum?
It is a challenge. I mean, if the goal is to actually place all these individuals into a custodial setting and hold them in facilities, we certainly don't have that, but it's also not necessary for us to do that. Under the last administration, when we saw numbers of families coming, but nothing like what we've seen under this administration, they had a program in place called the Family Case Management Program. It was a small program. It was resource intensive, but also was extremely cheap, right? It was resource intensive because it actually leveraged the ability of people to come together and provide at the right time and in the right way and in the right amount the kinds of services and supports and legal access and know your rights information and social supports that were required to ensure positive outcomes. So you had families going through this family case management program where they were not held in one of these large-scale detention camps, but they were faithfully reporting for all of their removal proceedings. They were actually learning pretty quickly early on whether they might have a chance of protection down the road. And in some cases, people were actually, voluntarily choosing to no longer go through the immigration court process and to be safely and effectively repatriated back to their home country because they realized they wouldn't actually qualify for relief. So that was a program that did exist before this administration took office, and they've ended that program because, again, they're not trying to find solutions.
We've seen members of Congress go down, and usually depending on their political party, we get a different report about the conditions in these facilities where the kids are being held. What's really going on there? What is it like inside of these facilities?
I think it's extremely grim. I mean, when I was working for Congress back in 2014, frankly, and we went to some of the facilities when the unaccompanied children were coming in largest numbers before you saw quite as many families coming. These are not facilities that are at all equipped to handle children, certainly not for any period of time. And they're the same facilities we're seeing now, but with larger numbers and with an administration that again is not trying to find a way out of it, right? So in 2014, when very large numbers of people were coming, I didn't agree with everything the Obama administration did to respond to that situation. They leaned in very heavily to the idea of family detention. They did a number of things that raised a lot of concern for me in 2014 when I was working in Congress, but everything they were doing was done with an eye toward trying to address the situation, trying to, get kids out of facilities where they're being held along the border for periods of time that were so long that it was unlawful. Again, I didn't agree with all their solutions, but they were trying to get them out and they were trying to get them someplace else. This administration is not doing that, right? Like for them, the visuals actually are an opportunity because they're an opportunity to drive ever more draconian policies and to increase the rhetoric and increase the fear to try and mobilize their base. And so they're using it as an opportunity rather than as something they want to try and address.
How long are these kids? How long can these kids be held in these detention centers?
So under our laws, kids have to be released from these facilities within 72 hours.
And in fact.
I mean, some of the reports that were coming out a few months ago or so were kids who were being held for 3 weeks or up to a month. Let's be clear about this. These are small cells that are designed to hold maybe like 20 people that are holding 80 people who can't, sit down. They can't, they're forced to stand up. There's one toilet that's open air. It's very, very cold. Conditions are extremely unsanitary. We have had children in government custody who have been dying as a result of preventable diseases because we simply don't have the political will, frankly, to prevent it. And I think it's not, in this case, it's not a question of just of just neglect. It's willful neglect. I mean, they understand what's happening here. The warning signs were all there, and we've continued to pursue these policies.
But of course, this entire problem would disappear if we would only build the wall.
Yeah, I mean, I testified before the House Budget Committee maybe about a month and a half or so ago, and one of the members said to me, well, of course we agree on border security. I'm so glad to hear you agree on border security, and that's why we need the wall. And what I said was, look, I want to be clear. If your vision of border security begins at the border, you've lost. Like you've totally misunderstood what's happening. Border security, the integrity of our borders is something that I can get behind. I understand why it's important to have borders in a country. But if the only way in which you plan on maintaining the integrity of those borders is by physically stopping people from being able to come across the border, that makes no sense at all. You need to begin that process by recognizing that you have a global footprint and there are things happening in 99% of the world that, are going to affect whether people want to leave those countries and where they may want to go. You have to understand that if there are functional legal opportunities for people to come through the system, or it's a dream or envision that one day if they do something right, they might find a way to come through the system, then that provides, a huge opportunity to relieve the strain on a system that otherwise would rely on them just coming straight to our border and seeing if they can get through, right? So border security has to be understood much more holistically as being the last point on the long continuum.
I want to ask you about some of the myths, if you will, that coming from California, I've always heard about immigrants. Maybe the most common is that they're coming here and they're taking jobs from Americans and driving wages down.
Yeah, so the National Academies of Sciences did a really exhaustive study 2 years ago where they had a huge panel of experts. They looked at all the literature basically, and essentially what they found is that by and large immigrants are complementing American workers in the workforce, that when immigrants come in, they create opportunities largely because Americans actually have a skill that many immigrants don't have, which is, native fluency in English. And so they have the ability to go from being a construction worker to being a foreman, for instance. And so the opportunity to have their, to complement their skills then allows for that. If you have more folks who are going to be working in a construction site, you may have more opportunities for engineers and architects to be helping to expand projects. And so overall, there's a large complement to the workforce.
And I'm sorry.
In terms of wages, I would say the wage effect is extremely small, if not negligible. But there is a wage impact. There's a big wage bonus when you go from an unauthorized status to a lawful status. And so absolutely it is the case that, while there is not a measurable really effect on wages broadly of immigration, the individuals who are working do see a wage benefit when they are able to work with authorization. And you can imagine that helps to sort of lift all tides as well.
Isn't it also true that the jobs that they're taking for a large part are jobs that Americans don't want?
I mean, it's a little bit of an oversimplification in the sense that, we did a study a few years ago with some economists to look at the 7 million unauthorized workers who are in the workforce. And they're in every single state, in every single industry. I mean, you have undocumented immigrants working in education, working in medicine, working in as home health aides. I mean, they're doing a lot of different jobs throughout our sector. So it's a bit of an oversimplification, I think. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important point to make because while in some ways it would be sort of, comforting or simplistic to be able to say they're taking jobs we would never take and therefore obviously they're not competing, they're not only just doing that, they are certainly taking jobs that Americans historically in large enough numbers will not take. Really hard, backbreaking jobs that help to create the conditions that we all benefit from. But they're also taking jobs that we all depend upon because they're just like us, right? And so they are working, they're undocumented immigrants that I know who are lawyers today. They're undocumented immigrants who are serving as home health aides and taking care of elderly people as they leave the workforce. I mean, a lot of really essential work throughout the entire economy in our society that are being provided.
And Donald Trump has added another argument here, which is that most of these illegal immigrants are committing crimes, serious crimes, and this is the criminals and the rapists and the terrorists that that we ought to round up and deport.
Yeah, I mean, so that has definitely been very exhaustively studied. And it's absolutely the case that immigrants, by and large, are less likely to be committing crimes than native-born Americans, and undocumented immigrants are even more less likely to be committing crimes. The one statistic that they point to, which they try to drive energy around, is the percentage of the federal prison population today who is foreign-born. But actually, if you look at the fact that for the last 10 to 12 years, the number one prosecution priority for federal prosecutors has been illegal entry and illegal entry after removal, which are crimes that only a foreign-born person could even be prosecuted with, it just stands to reason, basically, that most of the folks who would be in our federal prison system, or a lot of the folks in the federal prison system, are foreign-born, right? So essentially, they're sort of cooking the books by over-prosecuting foreign-born people for these specific immigration-related crimes, and then saying the fact that you've got a good number of foreign-born folks in our prison system is proof that somehow they're more criminally inclined than anybody else.
So does it make sense then to decriminalize crossing the border?
It is like the hot topic of the day. So from my perspective, I think it is important to recognize that these crimes, 1325, 1326, have been definitely over-prosecuted in the last 10 to 12 years. I mean, it makes no sense at all for them to be the top most frequently prosecuted federal offenses in the country. The ways in which these prosecutions have taken place, you see video of 40, 50, 60 people all wearing orange jumpsuits, all handcuffed and shackled, standing in a single federal courtroom with one lawyer who's met each of them for about 2 minutes before the proceedings, when they basically all are asked to plead guilty all at once. It's a total travesty of due process and justice. That's a major, major problem. And so I think absolutely when you see that prosecutions for illegal entry are skyrocketing while prosecutions for far more serious federal crimes along the border are plummeting, we've got a system that's, turned sort of, reasonable public safety and prosecutions on their head. Having said that, I think I would take a step back and say, what are we trying to do here? I mean, if we built a system where people could have an opportunity to come through the system, right? If we had an opportunity so that we weren't taking a father who's been here undocumented for 20 years with his family and deporting him, and then somehow punishing him for trying to return to his family, but instead create an opportunity to keep families together in the first place, I think we'd look at the issue of criminalization on the border very, very differently.
And don't these recent raids in Mississippi show that that's still the path that they're pursuing?
I mean, the Mississippi raids, I think, are really interesting. So my take on that, frankly, is that absolutely it's the case, I think, that when an employer is using immigration status or anything else to exploit or abuse workers, that should be something that should be a priority for enforcement, because those kinds of exploitative, dangerous conditions aren't good for anybody. They're not good for immigrant workers. They're not good for American workers.
But my understanding is that in Mississippi, none of the employers were...
I think we'll see. I mean, having said that, I think that's important to go after them, but in those circumstances. But I think people were very, very quick in this moment of so much political polarization to think that sort of like the woke position was to jump at the anti-Trump position and say it's so hypocritical. They're not going after the employers. They're just going after the employees. It's just like how Trump employs folks at Bedminster. I feel like what I did and what I would continue to tell folks is to take a step back. The solution here, it wouldn't be more fair or wouldn't leave us with a better world if on top of prosecuting these 680 workers, you also then went and prosecuted the employers, and then the 1,000+ people who still have jobs in those facilities are all fired also because they've lost their job. Like, none of that leads to a better world at the end of the day. What we need to figure out is that there are 7 million people working in the workforce who are undocumented. Many of them, probably most of them, are in totally voluntary work relationships with employers. And it wouldn't be a good thing overall for those employers to just panic suddenly and fire 7 million people who are playing a really important role in our society. There should be an opportunity for those workers and for those employers to do what they're doing right now, but through the law rather than around the law, because that's the way that you design a system that actually requires everyone to play by the rules.
The very complex issue of immigration, so many factors, on so many different levels.
Bill Press talking with Tom Jowitz, Vice President for Immigration Policy at the Center for American Progress. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressShow.com. That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. David Daley, John Judis, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.